Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Gad Barnea. And today we're going to be talking about the formation of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah specifically, and the Torah's use of Zoroastrian, Persian literature, Persian ideas. And the link to purchase the book will be in the description below and in the pinned comment. And the title of the book is Yahwism Under the Achaemenid Empire. So again, the link to purchase it will be in the description below. Also, the link to the PDF version, if you want to get it for free, is also provided in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment as well. So, Gad, thank you for joining me once again.
It's a pleasure, as always, to be with you.
So just for a brief recap, can you tell us a little bit about some of the Persian parallels that you're examining in the book between Yahweh, Yahwism, and the Achaemenid imperial beliefs?
Okay, so I'll actually start, if that's okay with you, with my latest article that's about to come out now.
Sure.
Which deals directly with these influences, and then we'll go back to a year ago with that what I wrote in that book. So right now, in this article that's about to come out, where I deal with the very famous story of the Moses and the burning bush, otherwise known as the call of Moses scene, where Moses, of course, is called to be the leader of the children of Israel and get them out of, bring them out of Egypt. This episode, especially a portion of this episode, the first portion of this episode, and it's a very complex episode in terms of the composition and the textual restructuring or redaction that it had, textual transmission of it. And so I won't get into the details of the textual transmission here and the redactionary layers too much. But this episode has a number, and I'm focusing on two main Achaemenid specific and Achaemenid Zoroastrian specific features that are worthy of note. The first one is the scene itself, which is Moses standing barefoot behind a fire theophany. So basically a supernatural fire, a fire that is divine. The deity Yahweh is in the fire and speaks out of the fire. He's sometimes the deity, sometimes a messenger of the deity in this episode, but he is associated with the fire, and the fire is definitely divine because it does not consume the bush. So it's definitely not natural fire. It's divine fire and fire that holds the deity itself. So we are facing a situation where Moses is standing before this divine fire and is being told to remove his sandals. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about, and to show how that is. We'll talk about how this is very deeply Zoroastrian. And then the second is the revelation of the name Yahweh itself and its meaning. So these are the two major topics. Now, again, this episode, as we read it today, we usually go and say, okay, chapter 3 begins with Moses going with the flock of Jethro to Mount Horeb, and then he sees this fire theophany. The chapter, at least this episode should begin a couple of verses earlier, with Yahweh speaking about what he's about to do, how he's going to save the people from their oppressors in Egypt, and which is a theme that's going to be repeated again in what is today chapter 3. It's important for the listeners and the viewers to note that chapters are a relatively late addition to the biblical corpus. So it's only about 1,000 years that we have chapters in the Bible. So these texts were more fluid, were read more fluidly in earlier times. And so we have this basically declaration by Yahweh that he is going to save his people. And then Moses, there's this addition of Moses going up to shepherding the flock of his father-in-law, going up to Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb here in this case, and then seeing the fire theophany. Now, this scene, before we dive into it, is not going to be alluded to or repeated or in any way going to play any role in after it is done. So it is, I think, just verses, basically verses 4 to 7, if my memory serves. But it's a very short episode where he is standing before the bush and speaking to Yahweh. And after he's speaking to Yahweh, he makes a series of objections as to why he should not be the one chosen. Okay, so that's the context of the what's called the call of Moses. Moses being called to be the leader of his people and to bring them out of Egypt. Now, this episode again is not alluded to. It's not really an organic part of chapter 3. Okay, it's not alluded to again, as I said. It's not. It's a very clear insertion into the flow of the text, and what it's actually portraying is a person standing in front of a divine fire that holds the deity. Okay, and in this the deity speaks to him from this divine fire and tells him to remove his sandals. In the Zoroastrian fire liturgy, which is part of the Yasna, the larger Yasna liturgy, and the fire veneration is a central component, or the central component, of the Zoroastrian Zoroastrian cultic life. The Raspi, or really the priests, basically of the liturgy, have to stand there barefoot. There is an entire very interesting relationship to the sandals that they have to bear. They have to remove them. They have to. One of them has to stand basically on them with one toe touching another. It's relatively complex, but basically they cannot wear the sandals when they are standing before the divine fire. Again, depending on exactly where they stand, there's a whole process of removing the sandals, and this is done when you are standing in front of the divine fire. Now, in the ancient Near East, we know of many cases where priests had to perform their duties barefoot. It makes sense because all the dirt that you might bring from the outside needs to be left on the on the entrance of the temple. It makes sense for a number of reasons. But what is unique about this case here is that this is the priest in front of a divine fire. It's not just any situation. It's not just any context. It's a person in front of a divine fire removing his sandals. Now, you might hear me say priest and ask yourselves a very logical question: was Moses a priest? And Moses is indeed portrayed as a priest in several places, very explicitly in the Psalms, where Moses is portrayed, is actually said is numbered among the priests, but also even in the later in the book of Exodus, in other parts where he of the Pentateuch, where he is the one who prepares the priesthood of Aaron and his sons. And during that preparation period, he is clearly a priest. He performs the duty of a priest. So he is kind of like an uber priest, or a proto priest, or a priest that basically prepares all priesthood that is going to come after him. So he is definitely a priest. I mean, he does serve in the temple. He does prepare everything that Aaron needs to to use later on, and certainly acts as a priest. So we have Moses as a priest, and we have Moses here serving barefoot before a divine fire. By the way, the priests in the temple and of course in the tabernacle before that also serve before a divine fire barefoot. So not just Moses on Mount Horeb. He is the first one according to this order of events, but all priests are going to do the same in the temple. And the temple, it's good to remember, also has a fire that is never to be put out. Again, just like the Zoroastrians up to this day, they have fires that cannot go out. Every fire up to today has a genealogy. It has a lineage. You actually know where it came from in most cases. And so fires are seen as something that is truly a touch point with divinity. And that was certainly also the case with the Israelites. Now, so we have a very, very deeply Zoroastrian image here at the beginning of chapter 3 of the book of Exodus. This is, it's important to note that and I think we already talked about it in previous episodes, that at least we have recorded one case in Elephantine where the Yahwists had a fire altar, also known as a fire altar. So it's a fire holder. I prefer the term holder because it's really not an altar. Nothing is offered on it. It's basically just a place where fire is being held for the purpose of veneration. So I'm going to call it a fire holder. The term fire altar has caused a lot of confusion, even in scholarship, and I'm trying to avoid it. So we have a fire holder in the temple, the temple to Yahweh at Elephantine. And so it does not seem to have been something unique. It's not presented, although the context is very fragmentary, it's not presented as something that is unique to Elephantine, but we can extrapolate from that and presume, and it makes a lot of sense, that fire holders, Zoroastrian fire holders, were present in other Yahwistic temples at the time. And so, and this fire holder is called in the papyrus, in the original document that we have from Elephantine, it's called an atarodan, which is exactly the same term that Zoroastrians use up to this day, atashdan today, but it's exactly the same idea. Atash or atar means fire, and it's basically a fire holder. So the Yahwists use a Zoroastrian technical cultic term to refer to this fire holder. If this was just any old holder of fire, they could have used an Aramaic term instead, but they use a cultic term, and they do this very, very clearly and very explicitly in order to denote that it is indeed an assimilation of a Zoroastrian practice. This assimilation does not mean that they converted to Zoroastrianism or anything like that. Assimilation was a feature of practically all ancient cults, especially if you're operating under a powerful empire. Certainly assimilating features from this more powerful entity is something that is completely natural. There was no problem with that. And so we have, in the 5th century, end of the 5th century, we have a dedicated, a documented case in which a fire holder is present in a Yahwistic temple. This might have also been the case in Jerusalem and on Mount Gerizim and other temples as well, and might have been the reason why we see echoes of this in various parts of the Bible, especially we're talking about the Pentateuch. So I mentioned this fire theophany in Exodus chapter 3. We have other insertions of divine fire that cannot go out in other parts of the Pentateuch, in Leviticus and the book of Numbers, there is the once Aaron is appointed to the priesthood, or the high priesthood, and his sons Nadab and Abihu are appointed with him to serve under him. They bring into, and that's in the book of Leviticus at the beginning. They bring into the tabernacle fire that Yahweh has not commanded them. That's what the text says, and because of that, they die. And so the fire has to be divine. Okay, the fire has to be divine. It cannot go out. It has to come from Yahweh, as is the case in this episode in Leviticus. It comes from Yahweh. It comes from above, and it needs to be maintained. It needs to be it cannot ever go out. So that is another case in which the eternal fire, this very Zoroastrian concept of an eternal fire, comes into play in the Pentateuch, and the two are related. We have a divine fire from a divine source appearing both in the bush that is not consumed and in the fire that comes from above in the inauguration of the Aaronic line of priesthood. And in both cases, it is a very deeply Zoroastrian context. And as I said, this context might derive, and I think it makes perfect sense for it to derive from the very deep knowledge that they had in various Yahwistic temples, documented explicitly at Elephantine, but very likely also in Jerusalem and other places, that they had in their own Yahwistic temples and at Rodan, a Zoroastrian fire holder. So that's with regards to the fire. What's interesting regarding the revelation of the name of Yahweh, the divine name, is that it is presented as Eheye in Hebrew, Eheye Asher Eheye, or I am who I am, or I am what I am in different English translations. Egoimi on in Greek, ego sum qui sum in the Latin, ego sum qui sum, which all refer to a verb of being. Okay, the one who is, the one who exists, who is the very definition of existence. And this is also a very Zoroastrian and a specifically Achaemenid concept. It appears in the very famous inscription of Darius in Bisotun, on Mount Bisotun, that we've, I think, already mentioned a number of times. Very, very important. I urge the listeners and the viewers here to read about this important inscription. Bisotun, Behistun is another way, another name for this inscription, and in it, Darius talks about Ahura Mazda, the main deity of, and really the central, and in some cases even the only deity of the Zoroastrian pantheon, and he says Zoroaster and the other gods who are. Now, these other gods who are almost certainly refer to divinities, not real deities, divinities which some liken to the angels, others to lesser gods, or basically helper gods, like this messenger that comes out of the fire in the fire theophany. So a messenger of God, which above a human, but just below or emanates from the deity. So these are the Ameshaspentas in Zoroastrianism, and so the other gods who are most likely refer to these Ameshaspentas, these divinities, these six divine beings that emanate from Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is sometimes also numbered among the Ameshaspentas as well. And so in Bisotun, we have this other gods who are, this verb of being, and in eternal being, they are eternally in a state of existence. It's in a present to be. in antiquity, this idea of deities who exist eternally is not new. It's not new with the Achaemenids, but a deity whose very being is eternal is new. What I mean by that is, for example, in the Egyptian theology, the gods also exist, I should say, the main gods also exist eternally, but they are constantly recreated. They exist because they procreate constantly. They are constantly recreated. They don't eternally exist. There's no eternal existence. And the same goes for Mesopotamian pantheons as well. The Zoroastrian conception of this eternally existing, eternal sameness of the deity is new, or is different. And that seems to have been the case here. What was adopted by the Yahwists in their conception of the deity as it is portrayed in Exodus chapter 3 in the Call of Moses. So we see here not just a Zoroastrian concept of the divine fire, but also the idea of an ever-existing God. I am who I am, using this verb of being. Now, one might ask, and that's a very, very good question, how do we know that in Achaemenid times, this idea or this tradition of removing the sandals was being observed? And what I always try to do in my research is to make sure that when I refer to anything in the Achaemenid period, that I can prove to a high degree of certainty that we can document it to the Persian period. And I was able to find a seal impression in Persepolis that actually shows the priest standing in front of a fire altar, and clearly with his feet in bare feet, basically, and the arches of the foot are emphasized to show that they are seen, that he is standing barefoot in front of the fire. There's a person standing on the other side of this fire holder, and that has flat feet, meaning that he's wearing some kind of boots or some kind of footwear. But the priest, the one who is tending to the fire, is clearly and emphasized as being barefoot. And this seal impression is dated to the 5th century, the early part of the 5th century, before the current era. So we actually have proof that standing barefoot before the divine fire was already practiced in the 5th century, before the current era. So all of this taken together, we can tell that the passages relating to fire, whether it's the burning bush or all of the passages that refer, especially in the book of Leviticus, that refer to a fire that cannot be put out, that is divine, that cannot accommodate alien fire, that needs to be treated with veneration, also barefoot by the priests. All of these elements that go from Leviticus really to the book of Numbers are very clearly, in my view, inspired by early Zoroastrianism or by Achaemenid Zoroastrianism. So now if we go back to my book, in my book, one chapter written by Itamar Kislev, a colleague of mine at the University of Haifa, deals with all of these fire, with the concept of eternal fire in the book of, especially in the book of Leviticus, in a very detailed manner, showing how these different verses were inserted. My article that is coming out continues what he's doing, and also shows how this episode in the burning bush basically continues these very same ideas, and not only continues them, but really attaches them to this tradition of the priest being barefoot before the eternal fire. So that is related to the eternal fire. Related to my article from my book, or my chapter in my book. This is a book that is a collection of essays that I edited together with Professor Reinhard Kratz from the University of Göttingen in Germany. And so my chapter deals with the so-called Passover papyrus, a Passover letter, and I show how basically and that's not really directly related to the biblical text, but I show how this papyrus and the observance that is defined in it is not really related to the Passover, at least not directly, but is related to the Yasna, related to the fact that these very same people at Elephantine had the fire holder and in their temple to Yahweh, and so in this particular document also refers to a Yasna. So this also ties to the burning bush pericope, which also reflects a variant or a version of the Yasna ceremony. This could be, and I believe is, a precursor to what will become in the somewhere in the 4th century and into the second and third and even the 2nd century. It will become what we know as the Passover. The Passover is a very, very complex observance, and it is it had a long evolution. I have another article coming out on that, and I believe that its origins are to be found in a kind of an extension of the Yasna observance from Zoroastrian roots. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question, but these are the basic anchors that we have in the Bible to Zoroastrian practices.
What do you make of Ahura Mazda and his opposite Ehrman, and do you see those two as having parallels with Yahweh and like basically like the betrayal of good and evil? And what about Ehrman and the serpent as my second part to that question?
What's the second part?
Ehrman and the serpent. Do you see similarities between those two as well?
Okay. So it's an interesting question. I think we kind of touched upon it in the previous episode. So Ehrman and Ahura Mazda are basically rivals, not exactly. Of course, not at the same level. Ahura Mazda is clearly the more powerful force in the cosmos. I look at the biblical text as reflecting knowledge of this dualism, especially in the Hebrew Bible, and then also in the New Testament in a much more evolved way. But this is not New Testament is not my field. But we have. So I'll go into the book of Genesis. I'll start there. In the book of Genesis, we actually have a polemical stance with regards to the Zoroastrian concept of good and evil. Okay, and I should basically maybe preface this by saying Ahura Mazda, of course, is the good God, the God who creates happiness for man, the God who creates the earth and the heavens, the God who creates saviors for humanity in the case of the Achaemenid inscriptions, that is the king, and specifically Darius I. So Ahura Mazda is good, is the good deity, and the deity that is responsible for the happiness of man. And Ehrman does not appear in the Achaemenid period as such, in direct Achaemenid sources, but Ehrman is the force of evil. And we need to be and again, since he's not directly documented in the Achaemenid period, we need to be very careful when we refer to this force of evil as at that period in time. He might very well have existed, and I'm sure there was something like that, but I cannot, in terms of my research, I cannot refer to it as something that I know has existed at the time. What certainly did exist at the time was the evil deities, or the evil that should not be, or the deities that should not be worshipped in any way, which are the Daiwas. Okay, and the Daiwas are proscribed in Xerxes, very clearly in Xerxes' Daiwa inscription. It's called Daiwa because it's related to the Daiwa, deities, and those are absolutely to be removed from the land and completely outlawed at that time. It's almost certainly a process that began before Xerxes, but Xerxes makes it very explicit in this particular inscription. And so, but not Ehrman as such. So we have the Daiwas, but not Ehrman as such. Now, in the book of Genesis, what we do have, and this is very interesting, is we have a deity that creates, and who creates mostly for the benefit of man, both in both creation accounts, in Genesis 1 and in Genesis 2. He creates for the benefit of humanity, and that's exactly Ahura Mazda. Now, a colleague of mine recently said in a podcast, I'm not going to mention names, but said that there's something unique about the way Yahweh is presented in the account of creation. In most cases, almost always, practically always, the creation of the world is a violent event. It comes out of a struggle between some good force and some evil force. Okay, it comes out of violence. It comes out of turmoil. Okay, and in the Bible there is Yahweh basically just willing something into being, and it becomes what Yahweh wanted it to be. There is no struggle. There is no turmoil. There is no violence. It is basically the way it is. And this colleague of mine said basically this is unique to Judaism, or to the Hebrew Bible. Actually, this is not accurate because this is also the case in the Achaemenid inscriptions. 75% of all Achaemenid inscriptions that are of any serious length, we have some very small, short ones who don't really give us a lot of information, but 75% of the important or the main Achaemenid inscriptions begin, just like Genesis, with an account of creation. A very short account, not like Genesis chapter 1, but basically following the same template. This is Ahura Mazda who creates. There is no turmoil. There is no violence. He creates the sky. He creates the heavens, the earth. He creates happiness for man. He creates man, and then he creates a savior for humanity, which is going to be the Achaemenid king. So we have exactly the same idea in Ahura Mazda, a deity who creates, a good deity who creates for the benefit of man, with no opposition, no Ehrman, no violence, no turmoil, nothing like that. Now, so there are many ways that Genesis can be related, and a lot has been written to Zoroastrian practices, including the creation of man. The reason I kind of am very cautious here is because I try to stick to what I can document from the Achaemenid period and not to the much later Sasanian period in the Common Era. There can be arguments for and against. I'm not going to go into that right now. But I try to be very, very careful to stick to what I can document at that time period. So if we continue down in Genesis, we have the struggle or the dichotomy or the opposition between good and evil very clearly already in chapter 3 of Genesis. So in chapter 3, as you know, there is a tree that is planted, and that tree is the tree of the knowledge to distinguish between good and evil. So you see that theme already there in the beginning of chapter of Genesis, in the context of the garden that Yahweh has created for the benefit of man. Again, very similar to the Zoroastrian or the Achaemenid Zoroastrian conception of creation, just with more detail. That's really the only difference. And so we have a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the ability to distinguish between good and evil. And at the end of chapter 3, after they have eaten from this tree, both Adam and Eve, the deity basically says, Yahweh basically says, well, now they will be able to distinguish between good and evil. Before they were not. Now, since they have eaten from the tree, they will be, and that's why they are expelled from the garden. The entire book of Genesis, from that point forward until the very end, until chapter 50 of Genesis, every single story is polemical against the concept of absolute distinction between good and evil, meaning that it is written in a way that is meant, I mean, it's so systematic that it must be conscious, that is meant to show that there is no a complete distinction between good and evil. Good can be used for evil, and the evil can be used for good. And indeed, the book of Genesis ends with this idea, where Joseph says to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. Okay? And again, from chapter 3, it is an anthology of stories crafted to show that everything that might be evil can also hold some good, and vice versa. And so the first thing we have is with Cain and Abel, the first murder story, right? And in that story, we have really the father of all of humanity, practically, because everything has to come through the only remaining son. So the father of all humanity committing the ultimate evil, murdering his brother. And so, and then from there we have all of the heroes of this mythological lineage, right? So we have Cain and Abel. Later we have Lamech, and then we have the genealogies, and we have Noah, and etc., etc. Of course, Abraham. Every one of these heroes commits evil and is good at the same time. So they are presented as the heroes of humanity, and of course, ultimately the heroes of Israel, of the children of Israel, when we come to Jacob and his sons. But every single one of them represents both the ultimate good and the ultimate evil. Abraham sacrifices his son. Not only that, but he also sends his son Ishmael to certain death. Okay, he also basically sends his wife to be raped. I mean, he commits absolute atrocities but at the same time, he is one of the good guys, right? The same thing with Lot, who is presented as an absolute just man, but also offers his daughters to be raped, and then he's raped by his own daughters. We have, of course, Jacob, and we have who lies to his own father. Okay, we have Judah, who wants to burn Tamar. I mean, literally every single story shows a hero that basically argues against the Zoroastrian view here. So here is not just, as you can tell, I'm not just showing how the Zoroastrian view was absorbed, but also argued against, meaning that it was known and influential, but influential in a polemical sense. So here we have a polemical stance against this idea that good and evil are completely opposed and cannot be combined. And we know this also from human nature. Every one of us knows that we have good sides and dark sides. I mean, we're not complete. It's very rare to find someone who's completely evil. I would even argue it's impossible to find someone who is absolutely 100% evil or someone who's 100% good. And so this is a different example of Zoroastrian influence, but not in assimilation and absorption, but here in knowing displaying knowledge of the Zoroastrian stance or the Zoroastrian concept, but now polemicizing against it. But by polemicizing against it, it shows how deep and how important it was and how well known it was among the Yahwists who wrote Genesis. Again, Genesis is from the perspective of showing good and evil, is so consistent. Really an anthology of stories that all revolve around this basic main theme that, in my mind at least, there is no doubt that it was collected at some point, of course, in the late Achaemenid or even after Achaemenid, but with full knowledge of the Zoroastrian view of good and evil. So I know it doesn't answer your questions on Ehrman specifically, because, as I said, that's not something I deal with regards to the Bible. That's, I think, is a full-fledged concept. It is later. It is to be dated to a later period, so I don't deal with it. However, going back to what we talked about earlier with the concept of being, of eternally existing, in later texts, texts that might be even parallel in time to the New Testament, we have texts that talk about Ahura Mazda, who was, who is, and who will be. Now, this type of expression is very much part of the New Testament. And we have an exactly identical passage also in the Bundahishan, in the Zoroastrian, in the later Zoroastrian, again, Sasanian time, Zoroastrian cosmological book. And in that book, Ehrman is portrayed as someone who does not exist eternally. So there is the contrast there. But again, this is a much later period.
What about the law code? What about the laws in the Torah? Do you see similarities there between the way the Torah talks about law or any of its laws to Persian thought?
Not to Persian, to Hellenistic. So very clearly to Hellenistic thought. Here it's not Persian at all. Actually, let me rephrase that. The Persians, the Hellenistic obsession with laws, and when I don't use the word obsession lightly here, they were absolutely obsessed with the idea of lawgivers and of making laws. could have been inspired by facts on the ground by the Achaemenids. The Achaemenids did set a number of important law codes, especially in Egypt, that were very influential, very important, and the Hellenistic obsession might be a reaction to the Achaemenid effort to establish their own law systems. I cannot prove that, at least not now, but just looking at the temporal axis, it makes sense that this was the case. Again, this is hypothetical for now. I cannot prove that. In any case, what is clear is that the Hellenistic world was already from the end of the 4th century before the current era, so about the 300s before the current era, and then well into the 3rd century and the 2nd century. I should say it also already started in the 5th century. We find it in Plato, of course, as well. But the obsession with laws is very much a 4th century and late 4th century, especially late 4th century phenomenon. And the law in the Greek sources, so the Greek historians, the Greek philosophers talk a lot about lawgivers, about law codes, about books of laws and different laws of different peoples. In the earlier collections of laws, in the earlier books that deal with these lawgivers. So, for example, the earliest one that we know of that is dedicated to this is by Theophrastus, the heir of Aristotle, and in Athens. And Theophrastus wrote a 3-volume book on all the known lawgivers and law codes of his time. And Moses is not, or the law codes of the Jews and Moses specifically is not mentioned in this book. If he was mentioned in this book, the church fathers who had access that which we don't have today to the entire corpus of Theophrastus' work would certainly have mentioned Moses in that context. Since they don't, clearly Moses was not part of the of Theophrastus's 3-volume work. But very, very quickly after this, a few decades later, we have Greek sources, again, not Jewish sources, although we start very quickly after that, we start seeing some Greek Jewish sources also dealing with this. So the Greek sources start talking about a Moses who is a lawgiver and who provides laws for the Jews. But this lawgiver and the laws that he is giving and the person of Moses at that time is completely different from what we know from the Hebrew Bible. And the one of the main focal points that these Greek authors treat in their books or in their writings on Moses is on Moses and the giving of the laws. They also treat they also discuss circumcision and some dietary restrictions, specifically with regards to pork. Only later on they will talk about things like the Sabbath and other aspects of Judaism. And by the way, I should add that really well into the Common Era, the focus is going to be of non-Jews. When they talk about Jews, they talk about Moses and about the laws and about abstention from pork and the circumcision. They rarely talk about anything else. In fact, what we can say about later views, really up to the late Middle Ages, about how Judaism was received by the non-Jewish world, is that the way they were seen comes derives more from the Greek historians' view of the Jews than from the Bible itself. Okay, I think that's a very important observation, also to understand relations between Jews and non-Jews really throughout antiquity. In any event, going back to the law codes, that is clearly a very Hellenistic influence on the Bible. It's not Persian. Here we're really talking about a Hellenistic influence on the Bible. Now, the biblical law codes are very interesting in many, many different aspects. Several of these laws are simply impossible to observe, and are clearly intended to signify something that is not natural, not part of this world. And I would focus on laws regarding leprosy and purity, and specifically in the case of leprosy, the laws are not natural. But by that I mean that the leprous person has to go and show himself or herself to the priest every 7 days. We know of no skin disease that you can really detect a difference within 7 days naturally, so we don't really have that's clearly not something that is normal. Also, they talk about not just the leprosy of the body, but also leprosy of clothes, whatever that means, and the leprosy of the walls of the house, whatever that means. And there are many, many examples, of course, also with the seventh year, the Sabbath of the land, giving rest to the land. That's okay, but also just forgiving all debts, not just every 7 years, but also upon the death of the high priest. You cannot really run an economy where you cannot give a loan money to anyone, because the priest might die tomorrow and everything will be forgiven. So there are a lot of laws that really don't make sense, but are added to this corpus in order to create a large corpus of laws that, in my view, basically reflect the Greek. They're a response to the Greek view of a Moses, again, not necessarily the biblical Moses, a Moses as a lawgiver to the Jews. And as I said, and we talked about it in previous episodes, there were many different versions running around, circulating in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, and into the mid 3rd century and even beyond, of different Moseses in the Greek world. You had the lawgiver, you had the Moses as a military leader, a victorious leader. You had Moses as an alchemist, as a magician. You have Moses as the teacher of Orpheus, basically the teacher of music and singing. All kinds of different versions of Moses were circulating around, and we find them in many different Greek sources. And as I said in previous episodes, it's interesting that the Greek sources are not polemical with the Hebrew Bible version. They don't show any awareness of the biblical Moses until much later. But the Bible does seem to show awareness of all of these different traditions about Moses, and polemicizes against them, either if they are complementary to the Jewish people, assimilates them and shows how this is true and even amplifies them, and if they are not, argues against them. For example, in the case of the leprosy, very consistently in these Greek sources, the Jews are presented as a leprous people, a people that suffered from leprosy, and Moses himself as a leprous leader of a leprous people. And the obsession with leprosy especially in the book of Leviticus, seems to argue I mean, very extreme. As I said, the leprosy everywhere, leprosy that needs to be constantly monitored every 7 days, and all of, I mean, showing very, very deep anxiety and deep concern with regards to leprosy. That seems to be a kind of a polemical stance against this idea that the Jewish people are a leprous people. Look how seriously we take leprosy. And so we really see, and by the way, even now, if I go back to the scene of the burning bush, in that scene, Moses, who is presented in the Greek sources as a leprous leader of a leprous people, in that scene, Moses is leprous for a second when he objects to the calling by Yahweh to him being sent to Egypt. One of the of things Yahweh asks him to do is to put his hand into his coat. He takes it out, it becomes leprous, and then he puts it back in, and it's healed again. Okay, so that shows him, that seems to also show awareness of the Greek portrayal of Moses as a leprous. Yes, he was leprous for a second, but Yahweh healed him like he did with the entire people. So that seems to also be a polemical stance against the Hellenistic conception of Moses and the Jewish people as a leprous people.
Can you talk about the connection between the Passover and Persian thought?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about it very briefly earlier. To go a little deeper, or quite a bit deeper, in the Persian period, we only have, outside of the Bible, the word Pascha. So the Aramaic term for a Passover. And the reason I say a Passover, it's not the Passover. It's not the Passover feast that we know from the biblical text. But the word Pascha appears in the Persian period at Elephantine, and only there is it documented. I'm sure it was documented in other parts, but that's the only place where we have it documented today, or the only text that we possess today that document this term. And so, in these sources, the Pascha, and I'm putting aside the what's called the Passover letter that I mentioned earlier. We'll return to that later on. But in these sources, it appears always, and then I also need to be cautious here. We only have 2 of these sources, and in these 2 sources, it is consistent. But again, tomorrow we might find a source that will show that I'm wrong, because it shows a completely different context. But so far, from what we know from the context that we do have, the Passover is tied, so again, I need to be careful here as well, not the Passover, but the term Passover is tied to situations that cause a great deal of anxiety. Very, very stressful situations where a lot hangs in the balance. Okay, something very, very important is about to happen, and the term Passover is associated with it. Now, it's associated with it always in a context of observing a Passover, something that has to be done. Okay, so to do a Passover, to observe a Passover, and in these contexts, it is almost certain, and in my view, it is certain, that the context is one of an action against the evil eye. Okay, something against the demons. So you observe a Passover in order to basically ward off the evil eye. We have this also in the book of Exodus, in chapter 12, where the Israelites are commanded to basically put blood on the on the entrance to their homes. Okay, and it is said very explicitly that this is done in order to keep the demon, the mashchit, the demon of evil, the demon of destruction, outside the home. And this is exactly the way these kind of ceremonies against the evil eye were practiced at the time. And so it is, to me, at least to my mind, it is certain that what was the term Passover originally was a household observance that was practiced very widely among the Yahwists, at least, but probably beyond the Yahwists, and it was practiced as an observance against the evil eye, something that would give a sense of security and give a sense of certainty to the people who observe this ritual. And that was what the term Passover would mean, at least in the 5th century before the Common Era, but probably well into the 4th century and even into the 3rd century as well. That's the term Passover, the term Pascha. Now, what is called, again, erroneously, the Passover letter, which we already talked about, really has nothing directly to do with the Passover. It is a letter by a person by the name of Hananiah, who arrives with great authority in Egypt around 419, or in 419, not around, in 419, early 419 BCE, and writes a letter to the people, to the Yahwists at Elephantine, telling them that they need to observe a certain ritual that is very similar in many ways to the Zoroastrian Yasna. Again, this is what my contribution to the book I edited argues. The word Passover does not appear in this papyrus. Neither does unleavened bread appear in this papyrus. The reason that scholars before me attached this document to the Passover is only that the dates correspond to the dates of the Passover, the 15th to the 21st of Nisan. But as I show in the article, these dates are basically just 7 days after the full moon. Okay, and so the first full moon of the year in springtime, that was a very important period in the entire northern hemisphere. This is the beginning of harvest. This is the period that can determine whether you will live or die this year, if your family survives. Because if the deity sends hail or flooding during the time of harvest, you will not survive to the next year. Okay, so this was a very important time period, and we cannot just say that these dates necessarily denote the biblical Passover. It's just simply a very important period. And so that's regarding the Passover letter, again, which I do not think directly refers to the Passover. Now, the reason I say directly is because, as I already mentioned, I do believe that the Passover, what emerged as the biblical Passover, which again is a very complex observance, came through a kind of a compounding or a composition of different observances and different traditions. So in one case, or on the one hand, we have this idea of performing a ceremony against evil, against the evil eye. In the book of Exodus, it is described as a ceremony where you paint the blood on the entrances, on the lintels of the entrance to the home, and later on it will be incorporated into the actual sacrifice of the Passover lamb. But you also have the unleavened bread, And the unleavened bread, I should also note, is part of the Zoroastrian yasna, at least from the Sasanian period onwards. I believe that the unleavened bread was part of the Zoroastrian yasna, even though, and I need to stress that, I cannot prove it. I don't have any pictographic or textual evidence to show that this was also the case in the Achaemenid period. Now, the reason I logically think it was is that the yasna originally was included the offering of a portion of meat before the fire altar. Again, not into the fire altar, but before the fire altar. I believe that when Zoroastrianism became the religion of an empire now, it became very expensive and very difficult also logistically, because the yasna is something that is observed daily. It's not a festival, it's not a feast, it's a daily and sometimes multiple times daily observance. Now, if you have across the empire to observe, this becomes prohibitive very quickly. So I think logically, again, I cannot prove it, but logically, I think that the switch from offering meat to offering unleavened bread as it is done today in Zoroastrianism happened already in the Achaemenid period for practical reasons. So this is the Achaemenid bread, and the only two observances that anywhere really where you have unleavened bread together, consumed together with a some kind of intoxicating drink. In the case of Zoroastrianism, it was the hauma drink. In the Passover, it's wine. The only two observances are the Passover and the Zoroastrian Yazda. Okay, and so we have this compound event, a complex event that brings together unleavened bread, brings together a sacrifice at a very specific time between the evenings, so between the setting of the sun and the appearance of the first stars in the sky, the first visible stars, very, very precise, and also the lifting sheaves of barley the day after. All of these are part of the Passover observance, which shows that at some point in time, different traditions were combined together because they occurred at the same period. Probably again because that period was so important for the survival of humanity at the time, at least in the northern hemisphere, that those who conceived of the Passover as we know it from the Bible basically just combined all of these different observances together, one of which is, as I mentioned, a ceremony against the evil eye, warding off evil against the demons, which is already documented in the 5th century in Persian time. It's not directly Persian, and the word Pascha is not related to any Persian term. We don't really know what it is related to necessarily, but it is documented in the Persian period.
Now, I know you got into this a little bit earlier, but could you expand on the miracles in the Torah? And do you see more parallels between the miracles and Persian miracles?
Yeah, I mean, I got into that. I mean, when you talk about miracles, I think Moses really, we don't have any. I was trying to think about your question. I mean, we don't have any records of miracles as such from the Achaemenid period, and even later. It's in the later Greco-Roman world, so in the third I'd say that even the 2nd century before the Common Era and later, the Persians are going to become associated with magic. In fact, the word magic comes from magi, the Persian priests, and the whole idea of miracles and magic will become central to the way the world, or at least the Western world, thinks about Persia. But this is not the case in the Persian period. It's not, at least it's not recorded, and it's so I can't really speak to that with relation to the Bible. Miracles such as the parting of the Dead Sea, miracles such as a stick transformed into a crocodile, and things like that are really associated mostly with the person of Moses. And the person of Moses in Greek, again, not Persian, but in Greek sources, is presented as a magician. In a little bit later source, even as a magi, as one of the Persian magi. So that is more of a Hellenistic view. All of these miracles seem to be more related to Hellenistic sensibilities than to Persian influences.
And in my final question, can you briefly recap on when you date the Torah, so that way the audience can see the connection with that, with the use of Persian and Greek thought, Hellenistic thought.
Yeah, so and we did an entire episode on that, and I recommend the viewers and hearers of this episode to go and get the full view. But here I will recap. Basically, my research shows that there is absolutely zero evidence anywhere among the thousands of different types of documents that we have from Jewish sources, from Jewish settlements, really from Mesopotamia to Egypt. And when I'm talking about textual documents, pictographic documents, seals, anywhere, we don't have any, even the slightest hint of any familiarity whatsoever with the Torah or the Hebrew Bible in general. Up until the end of the 4th century, really the first quarter of the 3rd century before the Common Era. This changed. This lack of any hint of knowledge of the Bible changes at that period, the beginning of the 3rd century, or really maybe some initial echoes at the very, very end of the 4th century before the Common Era. We start seeing echoes. We start seeing some familiarity of some themes, again, not necessarily developed, not necessarily exactly as we know them from the Bible, but we start seeing some movement at the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd that starts to hover around elements that we can recognize from the Bible, again, such as Moses, law-giving, even the idea of tribes, of 12 tribes, and names, and even personal names that are recognizable from the Bible. So these things start to appear on the radar very, very briefly at the end of the 4th century, just a couple of names, and then into the 3rd century and into the end of the 3rd century and into the beginning of the 2nd century, we start seeing more and more blips on the radar with regards to biblical knowledge of the Bible. And again, and to be more precise, it's that we're developing at the time that will eventually make it into the Bible. That is a more precise way of looking at this. So even when we talk about the 3rd century, it's not like they sat down and just wrote the entire Bible or even the entire Torah in the 3rd century. Everything is a process, but it does not have to be a very lengthy process. Now, to be very clear, I do not propose that everything was composed in the 3rd century or started to be composed in the 3rd century BCE. There is clearly much more ancient material imported and embedded within the Torah and other parts of the Bible. I have an article out on the book of Amos, for example, just the beginning of the book of Amos, the oracles against the nations, where I show, based on extra biblical data, that the author of this, or the authors, the school of that wrote these oracles, was very, very familiar with Neo-Assyrian propaganda from the late 8th century before the current era, at the beginning of the 7th century before the current. Because I have extra biblical parallels that I can show, I can date it very clearly. And I'm not saying it was written down in the late 8th century, early 7th century. It was, I believe, still orally transmitted. But these texts, again, not the entire book of Amos, but just the oracles against the nations at the beginning of the book of Amos. And again, even there, we can see several layers of addition and redaction. But those verses were written by someone who had very intimate knowledge of Neo-Assyrian propaganda, of contemporary Neo-Assyrian propaganda of his time. So clearly, into the Bible and even into the Torah were embedded much earlier texts, even possibly going back to the 8th century before the Common Era. So not everything is to be dated to the 3rd century. I do, though, claim that putting it all together as a book or as a set of scrolls that are interrelated, this idea, this concept of putting together an authoritative text, an authoritative corpus, not canonical yet, but authoritative, that is something that came out of the Alexandria library. Now, the Alexandria library was an entire project, a massively influential project that influences our lives to this day, that had a goal of producing authoritative Greek texts, authoritative versions of Homer, authoritative versions of Hesiod, etc., etc. And they did that. They developed techniques to do this. They used much earlier material, like I claim was the case also with the Bible, and added to them and composed texts based on these earlier sources. And these techniques that they used of how to solve contradictions between different manuscripts, for example, okay, or how to solve situations where the hero is not presented in a flattering enough manner. All of these different problems that translators had to use at the time are also implemented in the Hebrew Bible. So clearly, this enterprise, this idea of taking older sources, composing new ones, I do claim that large portions of the Torah were composed in the 3rd century also. Okay, but some elements are embedded into them that are older. So this whole idea of how to bring together different sources and harmonize them, resolve conflicts, etc. The authors of the Hebrew Bible at the time, influenced by Alexandria, used the same techniques that the Greeks developed, and used them on their own sources, and composed new ones, composed glue texts between texts that were that were related, and etc. So the Hebrew Bible itself came into being only in the shadow of the Alexandria library, but this is not to say that there was no sources, at least orally transmitted before, in certain circles, before the 3rd century, and clearly there was, as I show in my article on the oracles against the nations in the book of Amos.
And just to remind everybody real quick that the link to purchase the book Yahwism under the Achaemenid Empire will be provided in the description below in the pinned comment. Also, the PDF version of it, if you want it for free, will be provided in the description below and the pinned comment just below that. That being said, God, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.